Let's see. All right, if you're joining us and getting in from the waiting room, welcome. We're gonna give both people another minute or so to log on, and then give our system another minute or so to get through the waiting room. So let me just pause us for a brief moment before we get going. All right, I think that's a brief enough moment. And I would say welcome, good afternoon. My name is Giles Hawkins with Baltimore Heritage, and you are joining us for one of our virtual histories talks, our bi-weekly talks. We're rolling along. They're a partnership with Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. I want to say thanks to my colleague Olivia at the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. So thanks, Olivia. Before introducing today's speaker, let me just say a few quick things. One is in 2 weeks, so not next week, but a week after that, we have a talk on Art Deco in Baltimore. If you thought that was only in Los Angeles, you're going to be in for a really neat surprise. We might not have as much Art Deco architecture in Baltimore, but we have got more than many of us might think. So I hope you can join us for that. Want to say a quick thanks to anybody who has donated, voluntary donations of any size. A sincere thank you on behalf of both organizations. And then finally, we're going to try to save our questions, question and answer, until the end of the talk. So please put them in the chat box, and we will get to that, as many of them as we can. All right, I'm going to try to shut up so we can listen to our speaker today, Dr. Susan Langley, who I have to say, not even probably, I think has the coolest job in the state of Maryland, if not in the country. She is Maryland's state underwater archaeologist, and gets to become an expert on shipwrecks, among other things, which we're going to talk about today. But a few things that I just learned: if you thought that she was relegated, and that's not a bad thing to be in the Chesapeake Bay, but even out in Western Maryland, who knew underwater archaeology, let's say fishing weirs from colonial Maryland days, that's under her purview as well. And to boot, she gets to hang around with and actually train the United States Coast Guard folks. So when they're out doing their duty, they don't inadvertently run roughshod over our underwater heritage. So for all of that, we can thank Dr. Langley. And with that, I'm sorry, I wanted to say one thing. We were scheduled to have Dr. Langley come and give us a talk in person and a little tour around one of the clusters of not even shipwrecks, a ship graveyard, but then COVID mercilessly cut us off from that. So maybe we'll have to try to reschedule if we can snag her between the Bay and the mountains of Western Maryland at some point in the future. But with that, I'm going to say, Dr. Langley, thank you so much, and we are all yours.
Well, thank you. Let me just share my screen. We'll get right into it. This is an abridged presentations. I can't tell you about all the cool wrecks, but we will, I'll do my best in the time we have. I know some of you are sneaking out probably from meetings you should be at. Wait a minute, we need it to start from the beginning here. There we go. And or on your lunch break. So I'll as I say, condense this a bit. And I really, to lead on with from what John said, it should have been really the graveyards, ship graveyards of Curtis Bay. And I intended to change the title, but the publicity went out quicker. So I said, okay, I'll be consistent and stick with this. So we will be looking at 3 clusters of wrecks specifically. There are a lot more. If you ever get on Google Earth just for fun and zoom right in and scan all around Baltimore's harbors, you'll be astounded. A lot of them are just barges, but there are some amazing vessels in there. And the more I look, the more I find. But we'll limit ourselves today. So we have a little bit of this. This is the same vessel back in the 1920s, mid-20s, and this is 2019 that I took myself, not when I was scoping it out for another program. All right. Just to give us a little bit of a situational placement here, we are on the Chesapeake Bay. If you look to the upper left, you will see it. I know I can use my mouse and I will, but to the upper left, you'll see Baltimore City and the Inner Harbor. it really has spread out all the way around. Those of you who drive the area will see that this is the one of the ring roads for the city. It's the Beltway, as we say. This is the Civil War Fort Carroll right here. So we are talking about this peninsula right here, and we will be looking at some of our Coast Guard yard and some of the others. But just so you know, this is where we are. The Chesapeake is down this way. So we'll close in. This is Hawkins Point, as it's known now. Fort Armistead in the upper right is actually a Spanish-American War era site. It does have a fort in it. But we are going to concentrate on this side. And moving on to zoom in, now we can look at it a little bit more clearly. We'll look at 3 clusters of wrecks in here. And I'm going to start with this one, which is in Walnut Cove, and talk a little bit about World War I, where some of the majority of these vessels actually are from at this point. And so just so you know, we'll start here, we'll go up here, and we'll come down. During the First World War, they were losing vessels dramatically and decided that there was a need for 1,000 cargo carrying non-naval vessels. And it was determined to build 1,000 ships in 18 months, which is dramatic enough. The U.S. was probably the smallest blue water navy at the time, blue water merchant fleet at the time, and determined that it would, quadruple its power within these 18 months. It did not happen. Fewer than 300 of the vessels were built in some stage or completed. A few others were completed as barges, and a lot were canceled. And that's an entire talk for another day. But you can see these promotional posters at the time that they were going to be coming to carry supplies to our beleaguered allies in the theater of war. The one on the right, fabulous poster. We can see all the imagery and the clouds and the steam as well. There were endeavors to build metal steamships. They were on the Great Lakes, but to build the wooden steamers, they were built in all over the West Coast, the Gulf, the Southern East Coast. I think 3 were built in Maryland. They were sort of behemoths. They were slow, but although I'm sure they never told the merchant marine, the idea was they were expendable, and they were built with very green wood most of the time. It had a lot of issues. However, there was this enormous push by the U.S. Shipping Board Emergency Fleet Corporation. The war ended before many of them had reached fruition. Never a bad thing for a war to end earlier than you thought. However, all the vessels coming back from the theater of war were metal hulls, diesel engines. Some of these were still triple expansion, 2 boilers. There were 9 different designs that were being used, so they were not quite a homogeneous mass mob fleet, whatever you want to call it. And they couldn't sell them. They could hardly give them away. They managed to sell a handful into private service. They finally sold the majority of the fleet after 3 bids. And these vessels, here's an example of where the ones in the frame are shipyards where vessels that are in Mallows Bay, down on the Potomac in Charles County. It is our 14th National Marine Sanctuary. Now, we worked very hard to get that status for it. The other ones are vessels I'm finding and shipyards I'm finding and still adding to these lists. So you can see where these vessels were being built all over the country. This is Mallows Bay. And these vessels varied in lengths, but if you think about 250 to 60 feet as an average, that gives you some sense of scale. The left image is from the Washington Star, doesn't exist anymore, February 2nd, 1948, post-World War II. These vessels were, as I said, mostly shoved in here by the one successful bidder at the end of the day to be scrapped a few at a time. And as I said, it's a story for another day, but it gives you the sense of scale. There are still a number of these in Texas. There are still some in the James River. But as I said, a handful were sold into the private sector, and those are the ones we're going to look at for Baltimore today. And I will tell you that I've filched some of these photos from a book called Baltimore Harbor, A Picture History by Robert Keith. Bob was an amazing person. We unfortunately lost him in 2010, but he had, it's a great book. You can buy it on Amazon, and it's full of photos, and it covers all of Baltimore harbors. But we're going to again stick with Hawkins Point. So he lists on here all the different wrecks that are in each of these clusters. We are looking at a very limited few. And this is one of the images from his book. And the three vessels, they're a little bit hard for you to see. Let me point them out. This is the Dover. This is the Ashland. And this one is listed, whoops, there we go, I'm losing my mouse. This one was listed as the Fort Scott. I have to have a better look at it yet. I have not seen evidence of burning, but I found a reference that said it was sold for scrap in 22. It was not, it was sold to the Davison Chemical Company, which is on the immediately adjacent to it, abandoned and burnt in 1949. And that doesn't quite fit. There is another vessel called the Box Butte that is alleged abandoned in Baltimore. It might be that one. I have to do a little bit more work yet. So we have these three vessels. The others, I might touch on a couple of them, but these were purchased by, as I said, Davison Chemical. Until relatively recently, it was the last family-owned chemical factory in the country. It was founded in 1832, and they bought these vessels to haul pyrites from Cienfuegos, Cuba. They used them for a couple of years and found what most people complained about. They're too slow. At least pyrites aren't perishable. But they scrapped these vessels here. And the other collection that grew up around it is a little bit of the litter mentality. If somebody dumps something, you can dump too. In the background, where it says A. Smith and Sons Ship Repair, that company is still with us. It's Smith Shipyard. Wonderful folks. They built actually one of the vessels that's in here, maybe as many as three. And Jerry Smith is a historian in his own right and has some of his photos in Bob Keith's book as well, and a font of knowledge. So this is when in this is about 1934, I think. And you can see the condition of it. That is alleged to be the Dover. And in much better shape than we saw. The vessel next to it is the Stephen Chase, but as I say, that's a tale for another day. This one is probably the William T. Parker, and I will talk about it a little bit. So we're back up here for a moment, and we will look up at the top of Hawkins Point, and note also that white float in the middle. That'll come up toward the end of this talk. It's a barge. It's marking another wreck, but what we're interested in is this bulkhead. And if you look carefully between these red lines, you will see 14 of these 250-foot-long World War I vessels. They were brought in by Davison Chemical. It's now W.R. Grace, actually, but it was family-owned for a long time. They brought these in December, and there's a Baltimore Sun newspaper article brought in December 14th, 1929. I cannot find more information. How do you bring in 14 vessels? It would not, they aren't moving under their own power, so they're not like an armada. Are they towed single file in an array? I don't have more information. This is the only photo. The Baltimore Sun does not have their originals. They disposed of them a number of years ago after they digitized, but they didn't digitize the Sunday supplement. Apparently, they cannot find this a proper photo of this for me. These were intended to make the breakwater, and they were going to backfill it to gain another 30 acres to build housing for their workers. Now, this never happened, and I think if you consider the date, you can figure out why. The Great Depression, right? What was it, Black Thursday, Black Friday, Black Monday, whatever it was. The Depression started in October of 1929. It's December. Nothing more happened. So they remain there. There are other vessels snugged up against them in various positions. Again, if you play on Google Earth, this photo was Google Earth, but doesn't even do it justice. So we know that we have in this area at least 18 of these World War I emergency fleet vessels. And to pop down to our other little area for a moment, this is Bob Keith's book, from Bob Keith's book. There are a number of vessels in here, but there's only one listed as being from the emergency fleet. But if you look carefully, it looks like, and that it's supposed to be this one. There's also one here, and there are some other vessels. Now, one of them is a metal hull. One of them is the Portland, although it was launched as the Abra. down at Quantico. Quantico Marine Corps Base built several vessels, but I think the Abra is the best known one. And the Box Butte might be in here, or it might be the Fort Scott as well. But you can see there are a lot of other vessels. For those of you wondering about these forms, these are the forms for the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel. And as I say, there are other vessels in here. This is the most recent Google Earth image I had taken there. I have not been able to get down there myself to see if I can identify which ones are the World War I vessels and which are some other ones that I do have names for, but I need to try and identify. I'm going to approach the industrial firm on the left and see if I can access my kayak from there, or I may have to just paddle down from the Walnut Cove site. But I do want to take a look at these. And we'll come back to look at a couple of these at the very, very end of this. But there's also some other really interesting ships in there, but I'll tease you with those. I will talk about them another day. Going back to Walnut Cove for a moment, there's this one vessel, there's very little of it left, but a really interesting story, and I had to put it in because everybody asks about it. This vessel is the William T. Parker, and it was launched in 1891 in Milton, Delaware at the C.C. Davidson Yard. Not that large, 105 feet. You can see it's a three-masted schooner, rather smallish for coast-wide trade, but it had a kind of bad run. It wasn't quite a Jonah vessel, but it did ground often, apparently. And then in 1915, it was abandoned by its crew off of North Carolina because they thought it was sinking in a storm, and they'd given it up for lost. And apparently it continued to sail and was reported as far north as Maine, although no one apparently clued in that there was no one on it. Must have caught the Labrador current, came back and on its own, and was sort of wrangled, if you will, off of the Chesapeake and brought into Baltimore and used for, it became a workshop. They cut the masts off it and left it as a floating workshop. At first, I digress. Actually, they repaired it. It sailed a bit longer and then became a floating workshop. And here it is at the, I think it was at the Woodall Yard. And it was being, as I say, being used as a workshop and just open air. You can see they've got a for heating and brazing and whatnot. And they worked there and people lived on it until about, let's see, probably 1935. I think it was during the Depression. It started to get a little bit too dangerous to live on. It was not in great shape when it became a workshop around 1929 when it took the masts off. By 35, it had been rammed once and it had sort of limped into Baltimore. They'd made it into this yard. Smith's shipyard had determined it wasn't worth saving. And this is around Locust Point, for those of you who know Baltimore. And for 7 years, caregivers lived on it. And as I say, it served as this little workshop. Then it was getting worse, and it was moved in 1945 over to its present position in Walnut Cove, and was occupied into the 1950s when it just became uninhabitable. And the occupant, it literally rotted out from under the people living on it. So we see it now being towed over. The top images are 1965 and were taken by Robert Burgess, who's well known in the area for his interest in maritime history and his photos of the region. And then on the lower left, it was taken by Bob Keith in 1981. You can see the sides. You can see the centerboard trunk. If you're not familiar with these vessels, it's it's a board you can raise and lower as a keel. It's called a centerboard, but they keep in this big trunk when it's up. And often that's what survives and helps us identify these vessels. The one on the lower right, I took in 2019, and all that we see is the centerboard trunk. I'm sure during a blowout, when wind and tide are both going in the same direction, we might see more. But just the idea that it was our own little Mary Celeste and sailed off to Maine and came back on its own without anyone actually realizing there was no one on it is always a little bit interesting. Photo from 1954, you can see the Dover is still in excellent shape. Here's the Ashland. And as I said, this is a Catherine May, but we'll get there another time. This is the William T. Parker, not this one, surprisingly. This is another vessel. And then this is a actual ferro cement vessel, and it was built in 1921. A number of them were planned for the World War I effort as well. It was built in North Carolina, in Wilmington, North Carolina. There were about 10 of them built. We can account for 2 of them. The rest are a little bit, nebulous where they might have ended up. And I found this identified as the General Morgan Lewis on a geocaching site. Well, it's quite fragile now. And of course, everyone's using pseudonyms there, but I contacted the website master and asked if they could put me in touch with the person who was publishing under this one name. And I explained what I wanted. And the chap contacted me and I think was a little disappointed that I didn't want to talk geocaching. I didn't tell them not to do it, but I told them I would prefer if they didn't, because that's what I think he thought I was reaching out about. It's very fragile and someone is going to get hurt and the resource could be damaged as well. So both of them, I really didn't want them geocaching there. But I asked how he'd made his identification and if he would share his information with me. And he said, oh yeah, but I'm really busy. I'll get back to you after the weekend. Of course, it's the usual week or so. I contact him again. Oh yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, I'll be back with you shortly. And I never heard from him. I tried one more time and didn't get an answer. So either, he didn't have the information, he forgot it. I know where he found some of it from the Cape Fear Museum in North Carolina. I don't know where he obtained the rest. So saying it's a General Morgan Lewis is based on incomplete evidence. But I just wanted to know where he found that or why he thought that. And it would be interesting to be able to more definitively make the statement that it is. So again, here it is. That is the William T. Parker right off its bow. And that is what we hope is the General Morgan Lewis ferro cement vessel right behind it, but also an outgrowth of World War I technology, if not the war itself. And again, my photos. So I want to move down to this other cluster, back down where we think the Portland is, and these other vessels that are as yet unidentified. One of the vessels that ended up there is the Emma Giles. Now we're kind of getting past the age where people remember it terribly well, but excuse me. When I moved here in 1994, if you mentioned it to older people, they were all, the Emma Giles. It's very nostalgic, very beloved steam vessel. It was built in Baltimore at the Woodall Yard in 1887. It was named for Emma Giles and christened by Emma Giles, who was the daughter of one of the company officers from the manufacturer. She last carried passengers let's look at her, passengers in 1936. So that's why I say if people remember her, they are older, if they remember being on her. In 1937, she was sold. She was converted into a lumber barge and traveled for another 10 years, carrying lumber between Baltimore and New York. The captain used to brag about he had the highest capacity lumber barge going and the fastest because he retained the steam engines. Unfortunately, when it did reach her end, she was left on the mud flats near Quarantine Point and then became a bulkhead, a ship bulkhead, like the World War I vessels, but this was over at Locust Point. And finally, in 1951, was taken to Curtis Bay and burned to obtain any metal. She was built as a composite vessel, as were many of the World War I emergency fleet vessels, which means that there are wooden hulls, but between the frames and the hull planking, there's often cross-strapped metal. So there was a substantial amount of metal to be gained by stripping down these wooden ships, and they would often be burned to just recoup the metal out of it. And so in 1951, she was burned for her metal. And sadly, Emma Giles Parker, died the same year at the age of 81. So this is what was left of the Emma Giles in that area. That's an area I'm trying to get down to now to see if I can find any vestige that I might identify with this ship. And the other one I'm looking at is if you look in the middle of the paddle wheel hub, there's this marvelous little beehive skep sitting on a table. And it did say above it, busy as a bee, which was her motto. And as a beekeeper, this is very endearing to me. And I have asked around to people who should know, and even they didn't know what became of it. Sadly, it may have burned. I would dearly love to have that if I could purchase it from someone. If the vessel's totally been scrapped, then it belongs to the state, but I would love to see it conserved. If it's gone somewhere, it really should be in a museum, but I can still lust after it. I think it's fabulous. And I want to sort of wind up with a discussion of the last of the steamboats that operated in and out of Baltimore, because they operated quite late. And a lot of folks in their 70s that I'm talking to were shocked to know that, they were in their teens when the last steamer ran. And some of them, if they're from Baltimore, may even have been on it. So let me move up here. There. Okay, so this is one we're most interested in. This is the District of Columbia. It was the youngest of the three vessels that belonged to the Old Bay line that serviced Baltimore. And this one was built in 1924. The two other vessels were the City of Richmond, built in 1913, and the City of Norfolk, built in 1911. And strangely enough, the City of Norfolk was the last one actually operating. The District of Columbia made its last run I shouldn't say last run. It went into sort of mothball in 1957. They kept it in reserve in case one of the other vessels was broken down or was not functioning, which is strange because it was the newest. But since 1957, it was the backup for the other two. The City of Richmond stopped running in 1959, and the City of Norfolk made its last run into Baltimore on Friday the 13th, April 1962. In 1962, the Old Bay line shut down and sold all three vessels. So here's the City of Richmond looking a little rough around the edges. When it was sold in 1962, it was being towed south to become a restaurant in the Virgin Islands when it sank off of South Carolina. So met its fate there. Here's the City of Norfolk when under operation. When it was sold, it was being taken to New Jersey to be scrapped, was struck by lightning and caught fire. They did take the fire. They did put the fire out and continued the journey. So we have the District of Columbia. That's the interior of the Norfolk, by the way. Obviously a Bodine photo and just marvelous. And here is the City of Norfolk in happier days at Pratt Street Wharf. So anyone who knows, that's the inner harbor in Baltimore, if you're not familiar. And here is the District of Columbia in a much sunnier day, looking absolutely posh. And the stern, under operation. It was sold to Boston, actually, and served as a ferry between Boston and Provincetown for 1962, 1963, and was then purchased back into Baltimore, was going to be renamed the Chesapeake and made into a floating hotel and restaurant. The company ran into financial problems, discovered that to make it meet Coast Guard standards was going to cost more than they thought, and had left it just floating. And in 1969, that's the interior in good days, but in 1969, it caught fire. You can see it's looking a little rough around the edges anyway, having been rather derelict from 63 to 69. And whether the fire was arson, was intentional from an insurance point of view, or vagrants, or something else entirely, was never determined. The fire was put out, and it was towed to Curtis Bay. And you can see the World War I vessels that are forming the bulkhead in the background. It was towed to Curtis Bay in 1970 and left there. And around 1994, in fact, shortly after I arrived here, before I even unpacked, basically, someone in their infinite wisdom thought it was unsightly and it should be leveled off. Well, that, of course, then made it a hazard to navigation. So that is why in any photos of the area or Google Earth, you'll always see a barge moored over it so that no one will run into the remains of the hull. Why it wasn't pulled up farther, I think it kind of sank a little sooner than they anticipated before they could get it around into Curtis Creek. So unfortunately, that was all done, of course, without a permit from our office. And sad to say, it remains a hazard. And the last bit of sort of activity, if you will, in the area in April of 2017, the vessels off of the industrial area. I was telling you about where the Portland is, and that may well be the Portland, I'm afraid, caught fire. And I sort of cadged this off the news. Unfortunately, although it was reported, yes, it was a fire, there were different stories, whether it was vagrants living on board or whether it was drug use on board, or no one was 100%. And because they were just, quote, old abandoned vessels, really no further investigation was made. And I'm having trouble even finding the original documents. But of course, they're not just abandoned vessels. They're very historic and they're near and dear to my heart. So I will be looking more at these. People have asked about paddling tours in the area, because we do paddling tours around Mallows Bay. I have to do it myself first to look at how difficult it is to reach all 3 points. Walnut Cove is very easy. There's a ramp there. It's privately owned. The owners are Jaws Marina, and they've been very generous in allowing kayak launches off there, but they aren't open on Sunday, which is the day there's the least marine traffic. It's a very industrial area. So I want to look at how much effort is involved if one were to paddle around to the bulkhead, how much effort is involved to make this collection of vessels here with between tide and wind and currents and boat traffic. You want to make sure that it's open to most folks, or you have to be able to say only really good paddlers can do this. The other problem is, of course, if you fall in, it's a heavily polluted area. It's not that far from sewage treatment, where in conditions when they are flooded or overrun or heavy rains, it's often dumped untreated. And so there's a danger of E. coli. So it's one of those situations where I am loath to be responsible for taking people paddling. I do want to go and look at these vessels and do further documentation and investigation, but whether it can be open to tours as such is another matter, and it's something we'd have to consider. Obviously, if you're a paddler on your own, you're perfectly welcome to visit these sites, and at least now you have a little bit more insight about them. My email is in the upper right. If you wake up in the middle of the night with a burning question, please send me a note, and I will do my best to answer it for you. And certainly now I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have about what we've seen today.
All right, thank you, Susan, Dr. Langley. Excellent. Although it's wonderful that last shot, it is a little depressing to have the Baltimore City Fire Department's bastion of total flames there.
It is sad, but at least they came. They did come and put it out, so there's still stuff there. So I applaud their efforts.
Yeah. All right, we do have a couple of questions, but I just have to say, first of all, thank you for both everybody who identified yourself and where you're from. I think we have got more of an international audience on this Zoom call than we ever have. It is clear we will have to have an international shipwreck day here in Baltimore and invite everybody literally worldwide to come. And Dr. Langley, you're conscripted into joining us for that.
Well, I'd be happy with Mallows Bay is a talk in itself. There's a number of vessels we didn't get to today in this area. There's the Coast Guard yard itself is 100 years old, and I don't really train them, but we do work together to plan for oil spills or hazmat spills when they have to respond to that. They're very cognizant of the maritime heritage, of course, and Smith's Shipyard is historic. We just have so much we can do with Baltimore Harbor alone, let alone the rest of the Chesapeake. We can talk about Chesapeake pirates. We can talk about Mallows, lots of stuff.
We'll check on the extent of Baltimore Heritage's insurance policy to see if it covers removal of boils if people fell up. So we're on for a kayak tour. There have been a couple questions. Actually, just one more housekeeping matter. This talk has been recorded and will be available on YouTube on the Baltimore Architecture Foundation's YouTube site. So maybe Olivia will put a link, or at least the YouTube link up there. But if you just Google YouTube Baltimore Architecture Foundation, you can find it. Give us a day or two to get it up there. We're not the most speedy on that, but it'll be up there. including all the maps and everything. We did have one question, we can get to some more, but one was about what kind of regulations are there in Maryland or maybe even elsewhere for protecting these type of wrecks or other types of underwater heritage?
We actually do have legislation. Not every state does, and that's something. I'm on the Advisory Council for Underwater Archaeology, and we are trying to work with states that don't have protection yet or don't realize they need it because they don't think they have resources. And, you know, the latest one now, Utah is bringing in legislation, like you got to love them. And they're, because they realize you have rivers, you have reservoirs that have flooded things. We do have legislation that were anything planned for these areas. For example, the bulkhead, strangely enough, does belong, I presume, to W.R. Grace as a chattel of the Davidson Chemical, but they would still have to get permits to move them. And I don't think either they or the trust, the Maryland Historical Trust, the State Historic Preservation Office, would want that, because they were put in there before there were guidelines on how much chemicals are underneath them, and we don't really want to stir those up. So it's unlikely anything will happen that they wouldn't want to move them. We don't want them to move them. The other areas, they would have to come to our office. It's a section of the National Historic Preservation Act called Section 106, and it deals with compliance with legislation, not just historic, but also environmental and natural history. There may be creatures that live on these or live under them. They're now reefs, you know, of a sort, or an atoll, if you want to look at them that way. They're part of the environment. And so we'd have to look at the rules and determine, are they significant? And there is an actual test of significance based on the National Register of Historic Places. And then if they're privately owned, we can't do anything about it. The owners still have to apply for disturbing the bottom through the Corps of Engineers, apply with us. But something that's privately owned, one doesn't really control. But all of these are largely, because they're abandoned, are state controlled, and we would have to regulate what would happen to them. So no, you can't come take souvenirs off them, things like that. But you are welcome to photograph them and visit them and pester us for more information, because that's why it gives us the reason to go and do more research. So it's, yes, they are managed.
Excellent. All right, got another question about, are there any wrecks, and I guess I'm not even sure I'm using that term correctly, but remains maybe of Bethlehem, of ships from the Bethlehem Steel folks?
You mean that they built at Beth Steel?
Yeah, exactly. That's, I think, right. Yes.
Probably, but I haven't done enough work in there. I know that they actually built some of these vessels. Whether the ones they built are here, I have to go down the list and check where each one was built. I know that the captains of the ships complained that their wood was so green that they were, of course it's a euphemism, they were sprouting pine needles in the summer, and they expected cones for the Christmas mess, you know, because they would leak so badly and the wood was so green. I have not identified vessels specific to Beth Steel yet. We do have in the National Marine Sanctuary at Mallows, during the Second World War, Bethlehem Steel came down and built a lock, burning basin in the back, so that instead of hauling the wrecks up to Alexandria, where they were breaking them down a few at a time, they were going to break them down on site. In the Depression, the company that had been going to Alexandria went under. The people who worked for them won the legal right in court to break them up in Mallows Bay. And it's actually what helped poorer folk in Charles County, gave them 15% of their per capita income during the Great Depression, wrecking these vessels, scrapping them. But during World War II, War Measures Act, Beth Steel came in. They broke up about 12 maybe in the burning basin, and then said, you know, this is not cost effective. But the burning basin is still there that they constructed. So I would have to do more work to know specifically which ones came out of Beth Steel and where they might be. Not the best answer, sorry.
All right, I think we got one more question, and I will just say thank you to, it looks like, I think it's called crowdsourcing. We have got a bunch of questions in the chat box about basically how you can get at them by boat of all sorts of varieties. So thank you everybody who is helping supply answers to places where you can put your boats in to get at these. But we do have a question about, and let me just read it. It says, there's a group of barges lashed together in the middle of the cove. is there any information on them? And I'm not sure which cove it is, but does that
Probably
ring a bell?
Walnut Cove. They belong to the chemical company. And I think they are still, I think they're largely, I don't know if they're still in use. It looked like it the last time I was there. They might just be storing them there. But there are a number of them there. And they appear in, if you get on Google Earth and go through time, use the slider, you'll see they come and go. So I do believe they're probably still in use, and they're just storing them there. There are a lot of other vessels in that area. There's a couple of tugboats, and there's some other ones with interesting stories. There's just not time for everything.
All right, with that, we do try to honor both our guests' time and our own time and keep these sometimes brutally short. But I'll say thank you again to Dr. Langley. Thank you, everybody, for checking in. And again, this was recorded. Give us a day or so, and it'll be up on YouTube. And clearly, from the overwhelming support from all corners of, I say, all 7 seas of the world here, I will start now trying to convince Dr. Langley to come back with another talk. So
please do feel free to email me if you have a question or something we didn't answer, and I'll do my best.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks.